All right, everyone. I've been talking to a lot of people about what step 2 is and the Myers-Briggs, and a lot of people just don't understand or ever even heard of step 2. They think that it really is just a step 1. Hey, you're either one of these 16 types, one of these 16 boxes, and you're just like every other person that's in that type. So, with that being said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through. Sorry, I'm trying to get this to be just right. I'm going to go through a step 2 report. And I'm going to let you guys understand how step 2 can actually help you break the biases of your type. Because what step 2 does is it breaks each facet down, it breaks each preference pair down into what we call facets. And these facets change based on environmental circumstances. These environmental circumstances can include cultural development, upbringing, stress, all kinds of things that cause you to be one way. For example, you may preference extroversion, but you may be pretty contained. Or you may be, you don't like to introduce yourself to people, but you still can prefer extroversion. So step 2 really helps break those biases and actually form what your overall preference is and your underlying facets that may be different from that preference. So I'm going to kind of explain this report. This is a sample report for step 2. What happens when you take a step 2 assessment is you'll get this report. And the idea is the report is a tool. It's a tool to help you understand ultimately your type, and you choose your type. So when you get a step 2 report, at the end you can actually change the type that you think you fit best, and that's what we call type verification. The reason why you want to work with a coach is because we go through that process and we actually figure out what type is best fit for you, not just what the report says. I took the test and this is what I am, because honestly, my answers will change depending on my day. And so it's not all about that. It's about finding that natural preference and finding those natural preferences and identifying what your true type really is and what you were born as. Kind of like I was born left-handed, but there may be days where I might be using my right hand more. Naturally, if I did that for 10 days in a row, I might think I'm right-handed, but I know that I'm left-handed still. Bad example, but you get the idea. It's ultimately those inborn preferences that don't change. So with that being said, we're going to walk through what step 2 is. Okay, so as you can see here, the first thing is you get your step 1 included. That's your primary type. That's your base type. You'll see that the step 1 is just getting your four-letter code, getting your 4-letter preference pair. Okay, and remember that all people use all functions. So when I hear somebody says I don't use that function, even I've said it before, it's not right. It's not correct. We use all 8 functions, all their orientations. It's just some are easier than others to use because some are more repressed and unconscious, or they're more repressed in the unconscious mind, so it's hard to use those other functions effectively. I can get into shadow functions, but we're not going to talk about that. That's not what this is about. What this is about is understanding the difference between step 1 and step 2 and just identifying those base preference pairs. So when you get your step 1 results, so as you can see here on a step 2 report, you get your step 1, you get your step 2. You can apply those step 2 results to communicating, making decisions, managing change, managing conflict, and then how parts of your personality actually work together. That's type dynamics, that's functional stacking. Integrating step 1 and step 2 information, and then using those type to gain understanding, and then overview of those results at the end. We'll go over each of those, but not in super detail, but just to get an idea of what step 2 really is. So this is your step 1 report. Basically, this is what somebody would type as. Apparently, the person's name is Jack Sample. And Jack actually reported it as an introversion preference, a sensing preference, a thinking preference, and a judging preference. What that means is this person prefers introversion, prefers sensing, prefers thinking, prefers judging over the other 4 preferences. Okay, so it doesn't mean they don't use those preferences. So I'm gonna keep hammering that because a lot of people don't quite understand that process. So they tend to use biases like, oh, I don't get along with this type. I don't get along with this type, and that to me is absolutely ridiculous because there are preferences and facets inside of each preference that actually may be different than that base type. So don't rule out a type, or don't limit your romantic options because you feel like you fit best with a certain type. That's insane. So with that being said, it gives you a brief summary down here of what the clarity of preference is. Now what this means is, again, Myers-Briggs is not a strengths finder, so it doesn't determine how strong something is. What this is clarity as in consistency in which you answered questions on each preference. So Jack Sample here actually answered a lot of questions in extroversion and had extroverted answers, also had a lot of introverted answers. So more so introversion answers versus extroversion answers. So this gives Jack a slight clarity for introversion, which means there's a more likelihood that he could be extroverted and he doesn't know it. So the report is a tool. It's not the ultimate say-all on what you really are. So when I see this, I get pretty frustrated when people think, oh, I reported it as this, so this is what I am. It's not true. What you're doing is using it as a tool to help guide you. And then if somebody says, well, I don't think I'm that type, then you ask yourself, why did you answer questions that way? And then you can really start digging deep into figuring out your true type. And oftentimes I do have to change the type at the end, because it does help people understand better what their true type is when you change it, because then they relate more to a certain facet. So sensing, there's a moderate clarity, which means that there's a higher likelihood that they're a sensing preference than an intuitive preference. Again, they could be an intuitive. They could be a hardcore intuitive. They just answered more questions on the sensing side. Or thinking versus feeling, or judging versus perceiving. Same process, okay? So you can see that this person had a slight clarity on almost everything other than sensing. So down here, what you'll see is this is the step 2. As we move into step 2, you'll see the step 2 facet results. The 5 facets that are in each preference, or each dichotomy, do not cover or explain the full meaning of the preference. What that means is if you basically have, this report pumps out 5 facets in each preference pair, but it doesn't mean that's all what encompasses. Those are all encompassing of that particular facet, which means that there may be more facets to introversion than we have listed here. There could be 20 facets, 40 facets, 80 facets, but we have 5 on introversion. These 5 are the most commonly associated with introversion, so it helps the report actually have more accuracy than someone who doesn't. Versus, as you can see here on extroversion, there's 5 too, and these are facets that this report identifies and things that you answer. Each facet has a theme, such as ways to connect with others. Each has 2 opposite poles, so they have 2 opposite poles just like your preference pairs, and the facets are scored differently than their preferences. So the 5 facet scores don't add up to your step 1 preference score. What that means, again, it's related to the bullet point number 1, which is they do not cover explaining the full meaning of the preference. Therefore, you can have all facets in the introversion column and still type as an extrovert, or have a type as an extroverted preference. So that's unlikely, because if you really feel you're extroverted but you have all those facets, then you're probably confused about something. But that's why we ask questions, we identify, and we help move through that process. As you see down here, here's a list of all the facets. I'm just going to let it pause there. You guys can kind of see different facets and how they show up. So I'm going to talk through this as you guys can look on the left side of this page. So what you'll see under sensing, intuition, or thinking and feeling, and judging, perceiving, they all have 5 facets of each. So you might have a facet that's in the feeling side, but you're still an overall thinking preference. This particular ISTJ may have a facet for accommodating or accepting or empathetic, but also have a facet for reasonable or questioning. So they may be a more feeling-oriented ISTJ. So there's these facets, and they change with time. Unlike your natural preferences, these can change with time depending on conditioning, what you teach yourself, how you develop, that kind of thing, but your overall type never changes. So your facets can change, and it's fun to watch how you can actually change over time, and things can improve that you think you need to be for whatever reason. So let's look at how it actually reports out. So you can see here, extroversion versus introversion. This particular person has has one facet that's actually in preference. So they're mid-zoning on a lot of things. On the step 2, there's out of preference, there's a mid-zone, and in preference. Out of preference basically means you're operating in a facet that takes more energy to use that facet because your overall preference is introversion. So this facet appears differently than someone who has an in preference. For example, if this particular person was an ESTJ, then their enthusiastic would look a little bit different than a person who's an ISTJ, because this one takes a little more energy. So that's what these bullet points down here actually show you, is the difference, what those look like. Mid-zone means, really what mid-zone breaks down as to, it depends. It just depends, is what mid-zone is. So when you see mid-zone, just think depends. You can pretty much use either facet. You don't have a particular preference. You can just change back and forth. Mid-zone is not ideal necessarily, but it definitely can make you a little more flexible. It doesn't have a clear preference. What that means is there's no clear preference between either facet, and the report just couldn't figure out which one, essentially, that you preference naturally. So you may go back and forth. So this particular ISTJ some people may see him as an ISTJ, and some people may see him as an ESTJ, just because of these facets. What the people who may think he's an ISTJ may see him as intimate, seek intimacy, one-on-one, and looking for that one-on-one conversation, doesn't really necessarily want to belong or broad circle or join groups. But then other people may see him as enthusiastic and lively and energetic and seeking the spotlight and wants to get up and talk and present information, and maybe he's a good public speaker. Okay, so that can really throw people off, and that's why you see people here like, oh, I'm not an ISTJ because I have that side, or oh, I'm not an ESTJ because I'm too intimate, or I'm too contained, or I prefer not to introduce myself, and I'm maybe shy, or whatever, and all that will show in this facet report. So if you're really confused about your type, that's where step 2 can really help you, and help you and the coach work out where you guys are going with this, and hopefully identifying your type more effectively. Same thing, this ISTJ obviously has a pretty clear in-preference for sensing. Again, this is not a strengths determiner. It doesn't mean this person is somewhat realistic or somewhat concrete. What it means is they answered some questions on the concrete side, and they answered other questions on the abstract side, versus all the questions they answered on the practical side. Again, it's not measuring strength. It's forced choice. It's left or right. It's not how far left or how far right. So they're original. This is an original ISTJ. So some people may see this ISTJ as an INTJ for the sole fact that they're pretty original. They might think this person's intuitive when this person clearly has a sensing preference, as they typed themselves. Hey, I have a sensing preference, and they have more facets on the sensing side. So if you look down here, you see their approach to traditions is original. It's out of preference. So this particular ISTJ looks for what could be better, new, or different, like being original and different, but not so much to be out of the mainstream. So they still have that bottom line overall preference of sensing, knowing that it has to be practical. And they don't want to be so far out of the mainstream it sounds wild or crazy, unlike somebody who an INTJ who probably doesn't care about, being far out of the mainstream, has no interest in being in mainstream at all. So because their overall preference also is sensing, they're often seen as both creative and practical. So they have both this creativity, but they also have this practical side. And then may occasionally surprise others by going off in new and different directions. So that's another sign, is like new and different directions, occasionally surprising people because they may confuse this person with an NE user because they can go in those different directions, and that approach to tradition. So that's where people get kind of confused on this, and we can get into details of that, but I just want to cover this report in this video. This particular ISTJ also, you can see here, they have a feeling preference in accepting. They have a mid-zone score in empathetic and logical, so depends on the situation. This particular ISTJ also has an in-preference clarity for reasonable, questioning, and tough. So their mid-zone score, they may go back and forth. They consider logical consequences as well as people's feelings. They respect a dispassionate approach, but not in the extreme. Appear neither coldly logical or nor overly concerned with people's feelings, and may experience some tension between analytical and a personal approach. Because they don't have a clear preference, they may have not the ability to make a quick decision necessarily. So these are areas that, again, people are different. And step 2 really breaks it down to what makes you so different within your type. Again, you can see this person has a pressure-prompted P facet, but at the same time they have a really strong J facet. So that's where they also have another facet in emergent. So really this person has one J facet, and the rest there's 2 mid-zone and 2 perceiving. So naturally people might see this person as a perceiver, but they still naturally are a J. So you can see here how that appears with these different bullet points. Okay. So now that you look at the facets, here's some coaching tips and how to manage different styles of your personality type dynamics. This is an overview of the facets, and as you scroll down here, you'll see that your step 2 individualized type is an enthusiastic, original, accepting, pressure-prompted, emergent ISTJ. So this is quite a different ISTJ. It's an enthusiastic, original, accepting, pressure-prompted, emergent ISTJ, not just an ISTJ. So that's where people don't understand. And then if somebody doesn't have any, if somebody falls within all the facets, then you're going to see an in-preference ISTJ, and they're more likely going to look like the stereotypical description of an ISTJ. This person will not look like an ISTJ by the box description, because they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unique facets, 5 facets that are different than the ISTJ that's in the description. So your standard description of an ISTJ, usually it comes in this book, and it's called Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. And what you see here is, well, how did I get to INFJ? I don't know, but ISTJ, you'll see that there's this type description of what this person will seem like. So the more individualized you are in the sense of having different facets, the less likely you're going to sound, that's going to relate to you, that particular type description. But it doesn't mean you're not that type. This interpreter summary is really cool because it shows you how you compare with other people of this type. The blue is the average of people who typed as an ISTJ, the blue line. The numbers are where you typed, and then the shaded area is like the mean, like basically the whole range of typical ISTJs. It can fall within that. So most ISTJs aren't on the extroverted side, as you can see, but some of them can appear pretty gregarious or active on average. You can see that some of them do preference that side. Most ISTJs, because they're dominant introverted sensors, you can see that most of them don't have an intuitive facet side. That's pretty normal. But look at the thinking side. You can see accommodating and accepting. There's a pretty big range there if it goes over to the feeling side. And that's because most cultures don't particularly like questioning or critical people. They promote accommodating and accepting. So most ISTJs may fall within that range. And people may think that they're ISFJs when they're really ISTJs because they're accommodating and accepting. Whereas most ISTJs too, you can see they're pretty J-like, but this particular ISTJ didn't have as many J facets. So basically that's how step 2 works in a nutshell. Of course, working with any kind of professional, you can go through this report in detail, but that's what the report typically will look like. If you have any questions, like I said, just comment, or rather, email always works better for me. I don't typically log into YouTube, so I'm really bad about that, but I thought I'd get a video up there because it's been like months. So anyway, hope that helps, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.